I met this girl online a few weeks ago. Her name was Allison, and we had matched on a dating app. She looked pretty normal in her profile pictures, nothing too flashy, just a girl with a warm smile. We started chatting, and she seemed really down to earth. We had a lot in common, so after talking for a while, we decided to meet in person. Our first date was at a coffee shop downtown. When I saw her for the first time, she was even prettier in person than in her photos. She had this calm, laid-back vibe about her, which was nice since I was always a little nervous meeting people for the first time. We sat and talked for hours, and it felt like we had known each other much longer than just a few weeks. She told me she worked as a graphic designer and lived in a small apartment in the city. We had a good time, and she mentioned she had a small gathering coming up at her place and invited me to join. She told me it would be casual, just a few friends hanging out. I wasn't sure at first, but after a little convincing, I agreed. I didn't think much of it. It seemed like a fun way to get to know her better and meet some of her friends. The day of the party came, and I made my way to her apartment. She had given me the address, and it was in a nice neighborhood. I was a little early, so I stood outside for a bit, checking my phone to pass the time. When I texted her that I had arrived, she said she was still getting ready but told me to come on up. I buzzed the apartment number, and after a second, the door unlocked. I walked into the building and found her apartment on the third floor. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was how quiet it was. I had expected some music playing, or at least some noise from a few people talking, but it was eerily silent. Allison greeted me at the door with a smile, but there was something off about her. Her smile seemed a little too wide, and her eyes looked a bit too intense. She quickly ushered me inside and apologized for the silence, saying everyone was just getting settled in. Her apartment was neat, but it felt strangely empty. The furniture was minimal, and the place had a sterile feel to it. It was almost like it was designed to look like a showroom, rather than a lived-in space. She led me into the living room where a few people were sitting, and I greeted them. They all seemed normal enough at first, but as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Most of the people there were older than I expected, probably in their late 30s or early 40s, but they all seemed to know each other well. They were talking in hushed tones and glancing at me occasionally. At first, I thought it was just my nerves, but as the night went on, the awkward stares kept coming. Every time I caught someone's eye, they would quickly look away, almost like they were avoiding eye contact. The night went on, and the discomfort grew. I noticed that Allison kept disappearing into the back rooms, leaving me alone with the other guests. Every time I tried to join a conversation, the group would fall silent or change the subject. I started to feel like I was intruding on something I didn't belong in. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. But then, things started to get even stranger. I found myself looking around the apartment more closely. The walls were decorated with pictures, but something felt off about them. They were all black and white photos, mostly of people I didn't recognize. Some were blurry and others were strangely cropped. There were no photos of Allison with friends or family, just these odd, impersonal images. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, hoping to clear my head for a second. The moment I stepped inside, I immediately felt a strange chill. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the bathroom had an unsettling vibe. The light flickered above me, and I could hear muffled voices from the other room, but it felt like I was in a completely different world. As I stood there, I texted my friend. I told him I was at this weird party and that things were starting to feel off. I asked if he could call me in a little while, just in case I needed an excuse to leave. I sat there for a few minutes trying to calm myself down when I heard the door to the bathroom creak open behind me. I turned around and there was Allison, standing in the doorway with a tight smile on her face. I asked her if everything was okay, but she didn't answer. Instead, she just stared at me for a long moment before walking away without saying a word. I didn't know what to make of it, but I was starting to feel trapped. I quickly left the bathroom and walked back into the living room. The atmosphere had changed. The guests were now staring at me openly, and it felt like I was under a microscope. It was like everyone in the room was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. I couldn't stand it any longer. I decided I would leave. I told Allison I wasn't feeling well and needed to go. She smiled again, but it was that same forced smile. She didn't try to stop me, which made me feel even more uneasy. As I walked toward the door, I heard one of the guests whispering behind me, and I could just make out the words, "She'll be back soon. We always come back." I froze for a second, but didn't turn around. I walked out the door and down the stairs as quickly as I could. When I got to my car, I felt a huge wave of relief, like I had just escaped something dangerous. I texted my friend, telling him I was leaving, and asked if he could talk. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I needed someone to reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been part of something I didn't understand, something that wasn't right. I tried calling my friend, but he didn't answer, so I left a voicemail explaining everything that had happened. That night, I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about the strange way Allison had acted, the odd photos in her apartment, and the guests who seemed to know something I didn't. I decided I'd do some research the next day to see if I could find out anything about Allison or the people at the party. I looked up her name, but nothing came up. There were no social media profiles, no records, nothing that linked her to any real identity. It was like she didn't exist. I searched for any information about the party, but there was nothing about it online either. It was like the entire night had been wiped from existence. That's when I started to get really scared. What had I just walked into? Who were those people, and why had they all seemed to know each other? What did they mean when they said, "She'll be back soon"? We always come back? I tried calling her the next day, but the number had been disconnected. I sent her a text saying I wanted to talk, but there was no reply. I couldn't find anything about her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Weeks went by, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something sinister. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I thought maybe I was just overreacting, that I had gotten caught up in the weirdness of the evening. But then something happened that made everything click into place. I was out with some friends when I ran into someone who had been at the party. He looked at me for a moment before his face went pale. I recognized him instantly. It was one of the people who had been sitting in the living room at Allison's apartment. He looked around nervously, and then he stepped toward me, lowering his voice. "I know what you saw," he said. "You need to forget about it. Forget about her. Forget about all of it." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, frozen, as everything finally started to make sense. Allison, or whatever her real name was part of something. Something strange, something dangerous. And I had barely escaped with my life. I haven't heard from her since, and I don't want to. But every now and then, I get a strange feeling like she's still watching me. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I'm certain that I've never been a part of anything like it before, and I hope I never will again.